The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time has had a ton of beta cut content thanks to its many years of development, and the community around its beta content has lasted for over 20 years. But before tools that let us dig deep into the data of the game existed, game shortcodes were all we had, and one of the earliest, if not the first piece of beta content we found was this beta Ocarina Pedestal, located in the Zora fountain. So today on Cut Content, we explore what this beta Ocarina Pedestal is, why it actually played a much bigger role in the game's story, and how it functioned. Before we begin, please hit that subscribe button and turn your notifications on so you can continue to help and make this channel grow and for us to keep producing these videos. But as stated earlier, all it took to access that beta Ocarina Pedestal was a simple game shortcode. You entered the right one and you started off in an eerie version of Hyrule Field. Walk over to the path that would take you to the Zora River, and suddenly you'll instead find yourself at the Zora Fountain with Jabu right there. Here, everything looks normal, until we walk up to Jabu and see this pedestal. This was definitely never there in a normal playthrough. It has a clear symbol of an ocarina on it, but it doesn't look like the fairy ocarina nor the Ocarina of Time, and instead has these three big holes on the right. The ocarina is a clear reference to an earlier point in development where you'd fit the three spiritual stones into the ocarina instead of taking them to the Temple of Time. But the question is, why are we seeing it now in this map of the Zora Fountain and not in regular gameplay? For that, we first need to turn back the clock roughly 20 years to when people were doing a collective search known as the Beta Quest. The Beta Quest was a collection of different game shortcodes that access different versions of the world of Ocarina of Time. It is very glitchy, and map exits may either lead the game to freezing, enter a whole different area, or places you were never meant to enter, like the Chamber of Sages. But what these actually are a number of unused scene setups. What are scene setups, you ask? Scene setups are arrangements of a map made for a specific cutscene. For example, during that cutscene when Kakariko Village is on fire and Sheik is there, the game accesses the regular map of Kakariko Village first, then it finds the associated scene setup that tells it that these fire effects need to be there for the scene, and how Sheik also needs to be there in the scene too. In fact, we can enter the scene setup of the burning Kakariko Village through the beta quest, where we find a fire there in full effect, but Sheik static and at an angle at the front, waiting to be called up for the cutscene. But because of that, a number of unused scene setups exist too, that have a number of unused items in them. For example, the scene setup for when Sheik meets you in the ice cavern, where it contains this odd red ice block that you normally don't see in the final game. And of course, the Ocarina Pedestal in the Zora Fountain we just found in one of those unused scene setups. Therefore, this is why the ocarina on the pedestal is of the beta version of the ocarina, and that this was what the area once looked like. In fact, the Ocarina Pedestal isn't the only difference here. You have Tektites and Octoroks here too, which shouldn't be around Jabu when he's alive. Also, Jabu is a good deal further away from where he normally should be. Now this scene setup is very glitchy. Move too far out and the game freezes. Why that happens? We'll get to that shortly. But now, what happens if you go on the Ocarina Pedestal? Oh, of course, the game freezes! So why does it freeze when you jump on the pedestal? Normally, when an action is made and the game freezes, it's because it tried to do something it couldn't do. In this case, it looks like it was trying to activate a function that wasn't there. Obviously, having an ocarina symbol on it means one was supposed to likely play the ocarina on it, and it seems the pedestal would have automatically triggered Link to take out his ocarina. In fact, we have confirmation of that, as we have an account from a demo of Ocarina of Time at the 1998 CBS Toy Test, stating, "I found a rock with a picture of an ocarina engraved on top, and when I stood on it, Link pulled out his ocarina. I didn't know what song to play, so nothing special happened. But I'm sure there will be some very interesting puzzle involving this." Happy face. But considering this was old code that isn't in the game anymore, the game gets stuck as it doesn't know what to pull. Some have used a code called a specific lean code that would tilt the pedestal slightly, which apparently disables this code and thus lets Link walk on it. So the obvious thing here is that Link would likely instead play as Ocarina to have Jabu open his mouth in order to let him enter, instead of letting him enter through giving him a fish. But this was information known around 20 years ago. The rabbit hole now goes much deeper, with all the information we've gathered since then, much of which I personally tinkered with for this video. Ever since then, we have access to the debug menu, either through the debug ROM or even a simple game shark code of the regular game. Using this debug menu, we can access any and all scene setups in the game, including unused ones, like the Ocarina Pedestal and the Zora fountain we just saw. And the Zora fountain has 6 different scene setups actually, and this is one of them, which we saw located under scene setup 5, which if we enter it, it doesn't load. Odd? So I decide to load this up in a level editor, and I think I found my problem. Apparently, there are 2 Jabus on this map, at the same time and at nearly the same location. This would explain why Jabu look to have 4 eyes and 4 fins on them thanks to the overlapping of the models. Well, isn't that some nightmare fuel right there? But this, as a result, means there's too much going on in this map at once for the N64 to handle, considering the size of Jabu. This is also why the map kept freezing up after wandering a bit further in. So I decide to swap out the second Jabu for a simple fish. Enter the scene setup again, and the level loads properly now. It's still odd why there were 2 Jabus in this scene in the first place, but it might have been a simple developer's oversight, since it was just being tested still. But once you enter the scene setup, the actual cutscene that was meant to play, plays, and it's literally Jabu sucking in. Except Link doesn't fly in, again showing how unfinished this scene was. But the game locks here as the sucking animation doesn't end, but luckily debug mode lets us get out of it by hitting the right button on the D-pad. But it's strange then that we were able to enter this area at all when using a Game Shark code without it crashing instantly. Maybe it had to do with how it was a static scene and didn't have Jabu in action like in that cutscene that loads from the debug menu. The code of the 2 Jabus sucking in at once might have been a bit too intense to run. So now we can actually look around the area again in detail. The first major point is that Link can now walk on the pedestal itself without the game freezing up. It's likely because this cutscene takes place after when Link plays as Ocarina, the function of that pedestal is not needed anymore as such. But we're still not done here. For a long time it was assumed that this pedestal was exclusive to this area, but when we pull up the level editor again, we can see the list of objects that there are in this level. The one that associates with the Ocarina Pedestal is labeled as Waybackmachine Oka. Sorry if I mispronounced that, by the way. And apparently, this exists in a variety of other scene setups outside the Zora Fountain too, including a number of scene setups in the Kokiri Forest, the Sacred Forest Meadow, the Desert Colossus, and outside Ganon's Tower. And yes, even 2 other scene setups for the Zora Fountain. So even though that one scene setup had the Ocarina Pedestal in the Zora Fountain, the other 2 also have it. However, if we load them, they aren't there. So once again, pulling up the level editor, we look at the maps of those 2 scene setups. Now a little explanation here first. In order for something to appear on the map, it needs to have both the object, such as the Waybackmachine Oka that I mentioned earlier, and a corresponding actor with it. An actor is the actual physical property that is put on the map, which the actor corresponding with the Ocarina Pedestal's object, Waybackmachine Oka, is a warp pad. This opens up a whole other can of worms now. Placing the warp pad actor in one of the remaining 2 scene setups of the Zora Fountain that have Waybackmachine Oka in its object list indeed brings up the Ocarina Pedestal once you enter the map. But this is interesting, as the warp pad actor is literally the actor used to load up all the warp pads throughout the game, including the ones by the temples such as the Temple of Time. In fact, some of the locations that I mentioned having the Ocarina Pedestal in its object list also have the final game's warp pads in their object menu too, including the Sacred Forest Meadow and the Desert Colossus. And if you look at all the names of the objects associated with the warp pad, they all start with the name Object Machine, including the Ocarina Pedestal. What I theorize here is that the Ocarina Pedestal, while it did function to activate events in the game, also was the original warp pad. In fact, if you compare it with the final game's warp pad, the side textures are very similar too. The one by Jabu might have also been the warp you could use to have a shortcut to the old ice temple that was eventually replaced by the ice cavern. A warp pad by Ganon's Tower also made a ton of sense too, but likely removed for being redundant with the Temple of Time being so close. The Kokiri Forest is a little odd, however, since it's just a town, but maybe much like the Temple of Time's warp pad, which acted like the starting area for Adult Link, the one in the Kokiri Forest might have acted as Child Link's starting point since he does normally start there too. So the final question is, can we then reactivate these old warp pads in these areas? Theoretically, the warp pad is already in the actor menu of these areas, so you'd think it'd activate, but it doesn't. I thought that maybe the final warp pad in the object menu is programmed to take priority rather than the old one, so I removed it, and oddly enough, the old warp pad still doesn't appear. In fact, the only place it does appear are two of the Zora Fountain scene setups. The third one doesn't even work. I am actually unsure of what is preventing these to appear in those other areas, but my guess would be a code is in play to prevent them from loading, much like the ghost ship in Jolly Roger Bay in Super Mario 64. And this was likely done at all because they didn't want it to appear at all, without removing it outright and potentially messing with the existing code. However, they may have forgotten to do the same for those two scene setups in the Zora Fountain, and thus why they still load. But this was a long 20-year mystery of what this pedestal was, and after all that we have access to, we do now have a solid enough answer of its purpose, function, and even its multiple uses. But being a 20-year-old mystery, it shows how deep its beta elements can go, that one little pedestal can lead to such a goose chase to find many other beta elements around it. But the mysteries around the beta of Ocarina of Time are massive, and I plan to continue to further explore them, so hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Zelda and other cut content videos too. Hit the like button and leave a comment below on if you would have preferred this pedestal over using a fish to get into Jabu. So everyone, thank you for watching!